welcome to BioS3 Raw TV. Today we're going to talk about something that I actually haven't seen other people talk about, and I think that honestly it's the reason is they just haven't come off gear before long term, so they don't really understand what's going on. But this is based on an observation that I've had, that I have been observing. It's happened to me personally, which since somebody was talking about it, and there wasn't anything online about it, I started seeking out answers. Like, why does this take place? Now, bear with me. So we're going to talk today about what happens when you come off gear, like long-term gear use, and why the body looks like, it seems like everybody gets the same exact look. Like, so while they're on gear and they're really blown up and they built all that muscle, they have different looks. Nobody looks the same really. But it seems like when everybody comes off the gear and they shrink down, no matter what they do, they have a similar look. Now, Ronnie Coleman has this look right now. And again, if you go back to a lot of the greats, Lou Ferrigno, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the people back in the day that were really big, that were let's be real, I'll be honest, they were on gear. When they came off, they all have a similar look. We call it like the dad bod or the old man look. So we're going to do a little presentation here today. So here, we're going to do it like this. And I'm going to put my artistic skills here to work. All right, these are called mannequins where in art school, okay? So basically, it's going to be a representation of the human body. So we're going to have the collarbone here, and the joints, and joints, and joints, and hands here. All right, so this is our little guy, right? This is what we start out as. Now we have our rib cage, obviously, our hips, etc. Back here we have the scapulas and stuff from behind. You don't have to see that, so we're going to give him the little face up there like that. So what happens is we start out, let's say that's our base we start out, because I mean, I pretty much looked like that as a kid, right? I mean, that's how skinny I was as a kid. I looked like the stick figure. So now what happens is you actually just wind up building muscle, right? So you wind up building muscle, you're building muscle. So these muscles start to get thicker around here, right? And your shoulders get bigger, your traps get bigger. Now this guy obviously looks like a Muscleheads cartoon, right? Your legs get bigger. You're building all this muscle on this frame that's underneath there, right? And then we all have this, you're building up your lats over here, but your waist and your hips don't really build up. So you have your abdominals here. Now, you have this physique that you've built over time. This physique is balanced, it's big, it's thick. You put on, from where you started over here to this amount of muscle, you've put on quite a bit of muscle. Now, what I didn't realize was happening is as your body's building this muscle, many of us start out at a lot younger age than other people. So you got people like Ronnie Coleman that start out a little bit later in life as an adult. A lot of us start as kids. I started at 14. By the time I was 17, I was already competing. By the time I was 20 years old, I was already 270 plus pounds. So technically, your body's not even done growing for some of us when we start this. Now, even if your body is done growing, the body adapts. Like your skeletal structure adapts. And I wasn't understanding this because I was too concerned with building muscle. And I never knew that I would wind up in the place that I'm at today, where my arms and legs, as you downsize, it appears that your arms and legs are shrinking more than the rest of your body. So you wind up having the dad bod where your torso is bigger and your arms and legs are kind of smaller. And no matter how much you train, no matter what you do, you still have that type of look. You can increase the size of those, but you never have that full look of the symmetry and stuff that you had before. You have like this, they call it the dad bod look. Now, this is what happens. As you come off, or as you're building muscle, and the bigger you get, your rib structure actually changes to accommodate for the new muscle and the weight. Now, my scapulas are something that I noticed very clearly, and it seemed like it was all of a sudden, but it wasn't all of a sudden. So when I was younger, you could actually see my scapula. It doesn't even matter how much I flex them or I don't flex them. You can't even see them now because the muscle is still on my back. But I had my shoulder blades sticking out pretty much my whole life. And I started lifting weights, and I remember looking at pictures of myself from the back, and I'm like, man, I have these bones sticking out of my back. Like, I don't understand. Maybe it's like a deformity or something. Like, I didn't really understand what was going on. And as I started to build muscle, I noticed that those scapulars didn't stick out. They were flat. They started to wing. And even though I wasn't doing the lat syndrome, walking around like one of these guys like this, I noticed that my scapulas were different. And if I, took my thumb and put it under there, which back then I could get my hand under there, I could feel that it was totally flat. It didn't stick out anymore. It wasn't contracted and sticking out anymore. They were flat, even though I wasn't flexing. So I'm like, okay, I'm not flexing my lats or winging my lats. Why the fuck is it like that? So as you gain more muscle, your skeletal structure starts to accommodate that muscle in that size. Just like people that are really obese, you'll notice that over time, their legs start to bow in at their knees because they're so heavy that your bones are trying to basically keep that weight upright. And it starts adapting to cause more of like a pyramid, whereas our legs are straight up and down.
heavy, really obese people have pyramid legs, they call them. So their feet are out here and their knees come in here, and then it comes up to their hips. So they wind up walking with their feet sometimes wider than their hips, and then it comes up to their knees because the pyramid structure is the most secure structure that there is to keep something from toppling over. So their bodies actually wind up becoming more of a pyramid from the bottom down just to keep their bodies upright because they're so heavy. So the skeletal structure, as it adapts, what's interesting is, I don't know whether it adapts back the opposite way. When you drop that muscle, what is adapted to keep that muscle, the skeletal structure stays the same. So now what happens is we do all these exercises back in the day to stretch out rib cage out, like pullovers and stuff like that, because the thickness of the upper body, the rib cage really dictates that. So the bigger your rib cage, the thicker your upper body is going to be. The smaller the rib cage, the smaller your upper body is going to be. So you have these guys that have these ginormous arms, like you see some physique guys like that, ginormous arms, and their torsos are small. Then you see these other people with ginormous torsos and their arms are small. You see a lot of bodybuilders that don't have good arms. They wind up using synthol and stuff like that to try to get their arms up because their torso or their rib cage is bigger. Now you add the muscle from the chest in the back on that torso, and you have a thicker rib cage that's trying to hold all that muscle. When that muscle starts to go away, the rib cage stays the same. Now again, over time it may adapt. It took me 20, 30 years to get to where it is now. Maybe 30 years from now to go back to the way it was. I don't know. But for now, what happens is as that muscle comes off, because the muscle comes off pretty quick once you stop the gear, your skeletal structure stays the same. Now, I've also found that most men, I don't know about women, most men will lose less inches off their chest and back than they do in their arms and legs. So when they come off gear, their arms and legs seem to shrink up very, very quickly. And the torso seems to stay a little bit thicker, even with more muscle on it, even if you're not taking gear. So now you have an even more unproportionate, center of your body mass than you do with your extremities. And as you come down more and more in body weight, that skeletal structure kind of stays the same. So it gives a very awkward look. Now, with the muscle back on, it gives a very symmetrical, very pleasing look. Very good flow to the physique when you have that muscle on. But you take that muscle off, the skeletal structure is still there, and you have this kind of awkward look. Now, I call this the old man look. They call it the dad bod. They call it many things. But the problem is, this can't change. Your skeletal structure is not going to change overnight. So for me, every time I tried to come off drugs, I would get that look. I would notice in my arms, I always had pretty good arms as a kid. The arms stay muscular. You still have separation. You still have everything. But no matter what you do, the arms don't match that torso anymore because you're not taking the gear. Now, I don't know if this has something to do, we do know that the deltoids and traps respond, they have anabolic receptors in there. They respond crazy when you go on gear. So there's a look that you have in your shoulders and traps that if you're not on gear, you're not going to have that look. That's just how it is. Now, this is just a theory. I don't know. Maybe this has been proven. I don't know. But my theory is you have a certain amount of receptors in these muscles, the traps and shoulders, which basically, I want to say soak up, they allow the gear to work. It's magic, the best in that area. I do believe that in your extremities, for some reason, the way that the extremities grow for some people don't. Arms seem to grow very quickly for many people, right? So I'm thinking people like that, they have more receptors in their arms. People that's arms don't grow that fast don't have the receptors in there. Now what happens is people that don't have good receptors in their arms and legs still wind up having the dad bod, but a bigger version. So you see these bodybuilders that, they have really thick torsos front to back, long arms that people like to say they're long so they look like they're smaller. If you throw a taper on them, they aren't proportioned. So technically the arms haven't grown to that point. And many times the legs aren't up to par either. So you have somebody with a thick torso with thinner legs and arms that don't really match. And they're on gear. So I think a lot of this has to do with the receptors and how your body responds to the gear itself. And everybody responds to the gear differently. For me, my body responded very evenly. When I started gear, everything kind of grew in the same rate. And my body stayed very balanced. Now, as I came down again, when I came off gear, my body came down the same way. That was just my genetics. But as I look at people like Ronnie Coleman, these guys, you can see that these guys that really push that weight boundary, that body weight boundary in the 300s and stuff, when they come down, they really can't maintain any kind of shape or symmetry at all. Even if they keep training, the drugs seem to change their skeletal structure. And I shouldn't say the drugs, but being on the drugs, carrying the extra muscle over time, cause the body to adapt, which that's what it does. And that adaptation, was basically your skeletal structure being able to maintain that heavier body weight. It was functional. So your body adapts. Your body becomes its function. It adapts to what's happening. So what's happening is if it's carrying more muscle, it needs to be able to carry that muscle balance-wise so that you don't fall over and you're still able to move around and have motion. So your skeletal structure starts to adjust and things start to, I don't want to say hang differently, but they move differently. I guarantee if you took a picture of my skeletal structure full grown at, well, I started training when I was 14, but at 14 compared to 20, right, which was 6 years in between, that my skeletal structure in general would have looked a lot different because I was carrying 270 pounds mass at 20 years old as opposed to 145 pounds of mass at 14 years old. So just in general, and I don't know if, again, we're going to have to say that, Ronnie Coleman, as he started to carry more mass, his skeletal structure changed too. I mean, now that he's downsized a lot, he looks nothing like he did when he was that same weight when he was younger. It's a totally different look. His body's built like a barrel. His arms are thinner. His legs are thinner. Now, of course, he's had injuries. But this is something we see with Arnold. Arnold doesn't have the injuries. Lou Ferrigno now. I always was a big fan of Lou's. And I remember him being like, 65 years old, and he still looked like Lou. He was fit, arms still big, chest still big. And I said, damn, this guy, even though he's older and he's not taking anything anymore, he still looks great. Well, all of a sudden, Lou Ferrigno went this direction too. When he downsized, and it was like, oh, okay, so he was on a little bit more TRT or something like that. And that's what kept him looking like that. So when you see these guys that, their physiques go backwards like this, it's not that they quit training. It's not that they don't give a shit about themselves. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. It's the fact that they don't want to put the gear in their body anymore for whatever reason, whether it's a health reason, a moral reason, whether or not they can afford it, whether or not they just decide they don't want to do it anymore. And after that gets out of your system, your body starts to go backwards. You can't maintain that muscle mass. No matter what anybody says or who you are, you can't. So your body winds up basically keeping the same skeletal structure, downsizing where you put on the most amounts of muscle, and you have this awkward barrel-shaped physique with it looks like longer extremities, but thinner extremities. And there's really not much you can do about that. I mean, that's the way it's going to be. Now, again, do I think over time the skeletal structure will accommodate for less muscle? I mean, it doesn't really have to, right? So if you're dropping muscle, you're not putting a stress on the body. You're relieving stress on the body. So why would it reverse and go backwards and adapt backwards like that? Basically, what it should do, in my theory, is that it stays the way it was when you were the heavier body weight. Now, if you ever started to go back up in body weight again, your body will be able to control that or handle that muscle mass that's coming back on, and it happens very quickly with muscle memory, then you can actually see the muscle come back on and the body change shape. But as you start to come down muscle-wise, it's not like the skeletal structure goes back to where it was when you started training. I do believe that is an adaptation. That is a permanent adaptation that we've done to ourselves by training. It's again, something that I don't think has been studied, because why would they study it? I haven't heard anybody talk about it, but I've heard people point out and make fun of and laugh at the people that they come down in body weight. They come down, in size. They get old man, washed up, the things that they say about them, like, we has been, all these different things, dad bod. And they make fun of them, and I'm like, look, they really came off the gear. They were telling the truth when they came off. That's what happens when you come off. Dorian Yates is another prime example. He didn't have the biggest arms, but he had big arms. They were balanced within, he had a big torso. But now if you look at him, he's got a very still thick chest and back, and his arms have come down and his legs have come down quite a bit. So again, it's the same exact thing. And Dorian would be the first one to tell you that he came off everything. He was done except for his TRT. And, his skeletal structure kind of maintained the same. If you go back and look at pictures of Dorian when he was younger, when he first started training, his skeletal structure in general was much more symmetrical and had a better flow to it than it does now. And he was about the same weight as he is now. There's just a totally different look because he eventually got his body weight up so high that his body had to adjust and adapt, and his skeletal structure had to adapt to maintain that weight, to be able to keep human movement, to survive. It's all about survival. It's not about the way you look, it's just the way that the skeletal structure happens to adapt to that stimulus by holding the extra muscle. So be aware, guys, when you come off gear, you're going to shrink. I don't care what anybody says. The people that haven't shrunk are lying to you. They're still on gear. That's just all there is to it. I don't care what anybody says. I'm not here to argue. I just don't care. I know what I know. I've seen what I've seen. I know who I know. And I understand how this works. It's happened to me. It's happened to other people. And I don't believe that many young people are going to heed this and even give a shit. But making fun of these people, when they start to downsize, you're going to be there one day too. And if you're watching this video and you're one of these guys, one of these young guys, please keep this video in mind, which you're going to forget. Who's going to remember that 20 years from now? But the bottom line is, maybe I'll be in your head. And when you see yourself starting to go backwards and look like the previous, barrel look with the smaller arms, and no matter what you do, you can't get back up there. You go back on drugs and it goes back on. You come off drugs, it goes away. You're going to see for yourself and you're going to understand. And that's just the way it is. BicepsTraining@gmail.com. Leave comments down below. But don't fight. BicepsTraining.com is a blog. That's the way it goes, bicep. And we are Out.